Yeah, it's a big, I think I probably think about my family and my ancestors probably every day. There's a for whatever reason, my personality or whatever, it's something that I think about. I'm really grateful for. We had my specifically, I can go into both sides of my family, but specifically on my dad's side of the family, they're Assyrians from the Middle East, which is that they're traditionally like a Christian minority group in northern Iraq and northwestern Iran and southern Turkey, and so kind of in that general region. And so they're kind of the indigenous people there. And uh, in the in 1915, basically, and around that time when the Ottoman Empire was kind of falling apart, there was a big nationalist movement there that was basically like Turkey for the Turks type thing. They wanted to get rid of all the minorities and specifically like religious minorities. So they came in and it's known as the Armenian Genocide, but it wasn't just Armenians. It was also Assyrians and Greeks and everybody that pretty much got wiped out from what is modern day Turkey. And it was my own grandparents. My family lineage is kind of spread out because my grandmother was fairly old when she had my dad, and then my dad was the youngest of 11 kids, and so it was actually, although most people my age, it would probably be their great grandparents. It was actually just my grandparents that went through that Armenian genocide. So my grandma was her dad. When the Ottomans came in, they actually were all lived in northwestern Iran, is where my family's from. But at the time, in the war, as World War I, the Turks kind of came in there, and when and my took my my grandma's dad out to be shot, and all the kind of the men of the village they took out to be shot, and then the women and the children they drove off into the desert kind of on a death march. And my grandma had 7 siblings, and her mom, of course, and they got driven out into the desert, and only my grandma and one of her sisters and her mom survived. So their 6 siblings all died. And it was brutal. There's all the rape and pillage that goes along with that, and so they lived through something completely horrendous. And then
Were
the
they, sorry, I'm going to jump in. Were they taken out and left and then they had to kind of make their
no, it
way
was
to
like
somewhere, or like a
it
baton
was
style they
kind of
marched to a place?
it was kind of like a march to nowhere. They kind of just took them out into the Syrian desert and marched them until they died. Basically, hypothetically, there was an end point, but nobody ever got there really. And when they did, there were no supplies or anything like that. So yeah, it was a pretty effective way to just kind of get rid of them, but to be able to say to the European powers like, "Oh, it's just an exile. We're not killing them. We're just you know
We were trying to take them
moving them
somewhere.
out."
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but with no water, no food, no nothing, and they'd actually hired a bunch of the released criminals to head up the operation. So you can imagine the anyway the
Yeah.
chaos. And the but my great grandmother, when her youngest child died, she like kind of fell down in the desert and was like, I can't go on any farther. And so my grandma and her sister, my grandma was 13 at the time, her sister was a little older, and they kind of dragged the grandma to the feet, left the baby, and like kind of begged their mom to keep going, and they did. And kind of miraculously they stumbled off and stumbled onto a British military camp, and were rescued. So they did somehow, one of few that survived. They I'm sure my great grandmother was traumatized the rest of her life, which I don't think lasted very much longer. And so was grandma's sister. So practically she was orphaned, pretty much on her own. And my grandpa's story was real similar. He was in a village the Turks were coming in and burning down the whole village, and his dad was also in a wheelchair, or, was in a wheelchair, and basically shoved all the money they had in my grandpa's coat and told him to run for it and don't look back. And so grandpa like took off out the back door when they were coming in the front door, and he turned around just to see his, dad's house up in flames with his dad in it. And then he never did find his sister, never knew what happened to her. And he just ran and ran, and then eventually got to a refugee kind of encampment, and then was eventually taken in by some Jesuit priests, and they kind of, raised him as their own. so both of them were orphaned basically, and pretty crazy situation. They eventually met in Baghdad and got married, and then, emigrated to France and to Marseille right before World War II. And then of course that happened, and the Nazi invasion and all that. And they have all kinds of crazy, my aunts and uncles all have crazy stories of that. My dad was younger, so he was born after the war, but some of my aunts were in the French resistance, and they have all the stories of
that's cool.
getting breaking into some noodle factory and getting some food for their family.
Maybe I need to hang up with you and call your aunts.
Yeah, you probably should. They're much more interesting. Anyway, crazy history. All that to say, when I finally come around, after that in the 50s, they immigrated to the U.S. and loved it because, everywhere else they had been from was pretty rough. And so they were, my dad didn't teach me French. They didn't teach me any Middle Eastern languages, Aramaic or anything. They're like, you're American. You're an American now. So, anyway, they love it here. But anyway, that history to me is really valuable because it does put so much into perspective. Anything that I'm going through, including alone or something like that, it's just like, well, I just have nothing to complain about. And then not only that, but a lot of that history I had to kind of dig up from them and hear from them and get them to talk about. And what I was never taught was, oh, we don't like the Turks, or we don't like, I was never like taught anything from an angle of hate. They were always just my big happy aunt and uncle family, big happy family reunions, lots of fun. Like, I didn't meet my grandparents, they died before I came around, but there's some old videos of them, and you can just see they're just happy people, like, getting around, eating rabbit together with the family. You just see the joy, and it translated down to my dad, who endured his own degree of suffering, and it's like, man, but they all did it with a joy, which was really profound. And so that's a big lesson that I have taken from that, and that I remind myself of,